So now we're going to switch gears and we're going to have Dr. Hance Ellington come up and speak to us about his research. Hance received his bachelor's degree from Ohio State University in wildlife management, his master's from Indiana University of Pennsylvania in biology, and his PhD from Trent University in environmental and life sciences. He did his postdoctoral research in Canada and Ohio before coming to ONA in 2020. A large portion of his research and extension work centers around managing human-wildlife interaction, invasive species management, and promoting sound stewardship of wildlife and their habitats. So really, his work is endless. So we wish you luck with that. So we would like for you to share with us today.
Thank you all for coming. So today we're going to talk about coyote behavior and the lessons we've learned about coyote behavior from work in the city and the country, and how that might apply to coyote behavior on ranches here in Florida. So as you guys are probably aware, coyotes are medium-sized canids. That means they're related to dogs and wolves, but they're a lot smaller than most dogs, and definitely smaller than wolves. They're about 25, 35 pounds. Now, originally, coyotes were native to Central and Western North America, and that sort of habitat that they lived in was mostly grasslands. This was prior to European colonization. Now, after Europeans colonized North America and converted a lot of the eastern forest into agricultural lands, coyotes were able to expand eastward. They reached Florida as early as 1950 and then began rapid expansion in the 1980s and have become established in all of the counties in Florida, all 67, by the 1990s. Now, coyotes are notoriously difficult to remove from the landscape. This is because they have a high reproductive rate, and because of their social structure. If you remove one coyote or two coyotes from the area, there's going to be coyotes that are able to rapidly move in and occupy that vacant territory that you had removed the coyote from. So because of this, coyotes really are here to stay in Florida. So what we need to do then is to develop strategies that mitigate the conflict and mitigate the loss that we might experience due to coyotes. And one of the ways that we can do that is by learning more about coyote behavior. Now, coyote behavior happens at multiple scales on the land and across different temporal scales. So at the landscape scale, we might think about things that are happening over months and years. And we might think that coyotes that inhabit these fields behave differently than coyotes that inhabit this wetland forest, or coyotes that inhabit the forest edge along a residential area. This is a sort of landscape scale behavior that we can look at it. And a lot of that landscape scale behavior is why coyotes are able to rapidly occupy vacant territories. But today we're going to focus a bit smaller scale and look at patch scale behavior or pasture scale behavior. This is the sort of behavior that happens over minutes, hours, and days. And for coyotes, that can be things like the reason that coyotes move along a forest edge and how they move and where they choose to move. And while they're doing that, what sort of food resources are they using? Are they eating food waste and pet food? Are they eating berries? Are they eating rabbits and deer fawns? And coyotes are carnivores, but they are omnivorous, so they can eat from all of these different potential food sources, and that alters their behavior. Now, we do know some things about coyote behavior in Florida. Most recent coyote behavior study in Florida was from Qi Zhang. He was a master's student supervised by Dr. Rao Boughton here at the center a few years ago. And Qi found a couple of important things about coyote behavior. He found that home ranges, so where coyotes live on the landscape, are about 6,600 acres. He found that most coyotes are active from dawn to dusk and are pretty inactive during the heat of the day. He also found that coyotes prefer forest, shrub, and scrub habitat and improved pastures. Now, it was important finding in terms of improved pastures that coyotes didn't really respond to whether cows were present in the pasture. They simply preferred improved pastures regardless of cattle presence. And then he also found that coyotes were avoiding some types of land. They avoided wetland, dry prairies, and roads. And this sort of information is really valuable baseline information, but if we're going to develop effective mitigation and management strategies, we need to know a bit more. So what do we need to know about coyote behavior in Florida? We need to know more about their foraging behavior. That's what they're doing when they're consuming plant or animal material. And so we need to know what they're eating in Florida, but we also need to know when and where that occurs and what sort of landscape features they might be cluing in on to find their prey or food resources. And then finally, it's important to establish the link between the landscape, the diet, and the behavior of these animals. And ultimately, a better understanding of foraging behavior is going to allow us to minimize and mitigate conflict with coyotes, both human and livestock. Now, one of the ways that we can explore foraging behavior is by honing in on movement behavior. And if we can think of this in sort of simple terms and imagine this grid as our landscape, we might see some different types of movement behavior used by coyotes. And the first sort of movement behavior, that we see is encamped, right? These are animals that aren't moving around at all. They're sort of might be shifting around on the ground a little bit, but mostly these animals are resting. They're digesting a meal. They might be hiding from humans, or they might be caring for young. Now, the opposite of this behavior is traveling, and so these are animals that are moving really long distances on the landscape. They're not doing a lot of turning. These are animals that are moving perhaps from an encampment site to where they're looking for food, or they're patrolling their territory. They could be fleeing something, or they could be just simply exploring. Now, between these two sort of behavioral extremes is what we're really interested in, and those are foraging and searching behaviors. So here, a searching behavior, you imagine, is an animal that's moving on the landscape, perhaps along a forest edge, actively searching for a deer fawn that's hiding. And then the foraging behavior is when they found a prey resource and they're either chasing it or moving along a berry patch and consuming it. So it's a bit finer scale movement. So to look at coyote movement behavior, what we do is we capture animals in traps, and we put GPS collars on these animals, and then we can track their movement and look at that sort of movement behavior to then draw inferences about things like foraging behavior. And me and my colleagues have been doing this on coyotes in many different landscapes across North America. Today, we're going to talk about results from two of the studies, one in Chicago, Illinois, where coyotes exist in downtown landscapes, and then the other in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, in the national park there, which is a very different landscape from the city. So we asked a lot of different questions about foraging behavior in these two different landscapes, but one of the most important and basic questions is how much time do coyotes actually spend foraging? Well, in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, Canada, on the east coast of Canada, this landscape is a boreal forest. There's not a lot of prey resources. So coyotes are spending about a third of their time searching for prey and food items. Conversely, in Chicago, Illinois, where there's a lot more prey resources, but there's also a lot more humans, coyotes spend about a fourth of their time foraging. So they don't have to spend as much time foraging. And all that extra time in Chicago, they dedicate that to encamp. They're simply hiding from humans. They're hiding from humans sometimes more than 50% of the day. And then the next sort of question we looked at is when foraging behavior is occurring. And we found in both study areas that foraging behavior occurs during all times of day, but is most frequent during the dawn and dusk. And this is really similar to Key Zhang's finding that coyotes were most active from dawn to dusk. Now, his activity measure really encompassed foraging and traveling behavior, but we're finding the same relationship just with foraging. And then we wanted to look at where foraging behavior occurred for coyotes. And here, it's perhaps a little unsatisfying to say it depends, and it depends on the time of day. But there was one general rule that we found in both study areas as well, is that coyotes employed a close but not too close strategies for roads and trails. And this was best exemplified in Cape Breton, where there's not a lot of roads and not a lot of trails. Here, coyotes avoided roads when they were really close to them. So they tried to stay about a football field length away from roads and trails, but were attracted to them in general on the landscape. And so basically coyotes are trying to balance the cost and benefits that roads might give them on the landscape. Now, when we look at specific times of day and how coyotes forage on the landscape, we found during the day that coyotes prefer open areas, areas without trees. However, when they shift into the dawn and dusk period, and that's when they're most active, that's when they're doing most of their foraging, they're now avoiding open areas and they're foraging along those forest edges. That's where they're looking for prey. And they're preferring landscapes that have a mixture of forest, open, and wetlands. So this is in Cape Breton. And then at night, they abandon that sort of forest edge and then are simply continuing to avoid open areas and only foraging in forested areas or wetland areas. So returning to Chicago, we wanted to look at the link between foraging behavior and diet. And this graph is a bit complex, but it's looking at stable isotopes, which gives us like a 3-month window into coyote diet. And what we see is two principal axes here. The x-axis down here, that is how much anthropogenic food the animal eats. So animals over here are consuming pet food and human food waste. And then the nitrogen on the y-axis is how much protein is in the diet. So we found that as coyotes consumed more human-derived food, they had to make more short foraging movements and fewer long searching movements. So these animals knew where those food resources were because human food resources generally don't hide or move around on the landscape. So they don't have to search for them the way they would have to search for a rabbit or a deer fawn. And we also found that as coyotes consumed more protein, so these animals up here, so when you're consuming more protein, you do that by eating more animals. And so coyotes that were consuming more animals made fewer short foraging movements and more long searching movements. So they had to spend more time doing that searching behavior and less time doing that short sort of capture and forage along a berry patch sort of behavior. And that's what we would expect if they're eating mostly deer fawns and eating fewer blackberries. So what does all this tell us about coyote foraging behavior in Florida? Well, it tells us that coyotes probably spend somewhere between 25 to 33% of their time foraging. That 33%, that's probably the max that they would spend foraging here, because that's how much time coyotes in Cape Breton that are living in home ranges 3 times the size of home ranges here in Florida are spending. But we also learned that as human disturbance increases, and the extreme example is Chicago, Illinois, that coyotes are going to spend less time foraging because they're spending more time in camp. So if we on our ranches increase the pressure we put on our coyotes, they might spend less time foraging, but they're just hiding. Now, we found that coyotes forage at all times of day, but they're going to be most active foraging at dawn and dusk, and that's probably the same here as well. They probably employ a close but not too close strategy for roads and trails here in Florida. Now, there are a lot more roads and trails in Florida than there is in Cape Breton, so it will be interesting to see how they use the landscapes here in Florida. And then finally, coyotes when they're foraging are going to use different landscapes at different times of the day. But open landscapes and forest edges are going to, or likely important for coyotes here in Florida. And then finally, the landscape and diet both influence foraging behaviors of coyotes. And coyotes are notoriously, we call them a generalist species. That's because they have a wide range of food that they could eat and habitats they can use. But as individuals, they often specialize. So an individual that specializes on berries and on plant materials is going to behave differently on the landscape than an individual that's specializing on deer fawn. And so with that, I'd like to thank all of the the folks that have made the research I talked about today, both in Cape Breton and in Chicago, possible. It's only possible that we can do these big projects with lots of different collaborators and agencies. Right, so the question was whether if you increase trapping pressure or hunting pressure on coyotes, whether they have any reproductive responses increasing or decreasing. And there is evidence out of South Carolina that if you're increasing the pressure on coyotes, you are creating turnover. But as soon as those animals move into that new territory, they're going to immediately become reproductively active. There might be in that short period fewer coyotes on the landscape, so more of those pups are going to survive. So you are going to see a jump in recruitment in the short term, and then it's eventually basically you're creating population fluctuations, but you're going to see a short-term increase and then a decrease, and it'll balance out to be the same as when you started. All right.